When the farm girl had looked up, she seemed to be seeing past the portal and glaring at the people in the fairy hall. Even the king nearly jumped out of his seat when the girl seemed to say something directly to him, despite the fact that she shouldn't have even been aware that anyone was watching her. The only one who seemed unsurprised was Baron, who laughed as he made the image fade. She's always been able to tell when I'm watching her. Granted, it took a little longer this time, but she was pretty busy, as you can plainly see, Your Majesty. Louise was shuddering with horror and revulsion. That girl's a barbarian! Baron tightened his grip on the polished cane at his side. Because she's willing to give her mother final respects? At least she loved her mother enough to do that, instead of letting the soldiers bury the woman in a mass grave like they wanted to. The king slowly got over his shock, that the human had been able to sense them. She is something special. Louise sharply turned to her monarch, a new fear working its way into her heart. But she doesn't belong in our world. She isn't fit to be a servant in Baron's household, let alone his bride. The king smiled, suddenly getting an idea on how to solve this peacefully. Why don't we let the girl prove whether she's worthy or not? Haru reluctantly opened her eyes to the morning light, every fiber in her being still aching from the hard labor the day before. Catching a different feeling, she looked to her left to find that a small flower had bloomed next to her head. Her large eyes widened further, since that had never happened before, despite the strange things that sometimes happened around her home. It wasn't impossible, though, since the inside of her shack had a dirt floor. The flower was a modest pink, with smallish petals and a polished green stem. She smiled and raised one hand to delicately touch the soft petals. She caught a look at her hand and grimaced. She had never used a shovel for so long, and her hands were showing the damage from the burns and the blisters. She sat up and stretched before noticing some noise, shouting from outside her home. Did the soldiers come back already? I just paid the death tax. She softly got to her feet and moved to the curtain that served as a door for the shack. She pulled the rough fabric aside enough to sneak a peek. Her eyes widened again, not quite sure what she was seeing. In front of her home, a humongous white cat with a spot of brown on one ear was standing on his hind legs and had his paws held out in front of him like fists, shouting into the sky. Don't try that again, bird brain. The crow swooped down and pushed the fat cat over, the polished metal tube strapped to his back glistening in the morning sun. You already called me a bird brain, you idiot! Well then go fry yourself, you big chicken! You already called me a chicken! Can't you think of better insults than that? Despite how they were going at each other, they didn't seem to actually want to hurt the other. Haru was amazed that they were actually talking, and retreated further back into her sack to consider what to do. The two animals outside were obviously magical in origin, possible servants of the Lord of the Mountains. No one had ever seen the Lord, at least no one mortal, although he was a good fairy. Did that crow have a message or something to deliver? He must have gotten lost trying to reach the landlord's castle, and maybe asked the cat for directions, and it somehow turned into a fight. Sighing, she decided to ignore them unless they addressed her. She reached for the spare tunic and water bucket before walking out of her home, strangely slipping by the crow and cat unnoticed. She was still wearing the filth from the day before, and she was quite eager to get rid of it before she left. She had a small sanctuary that was neatly tucked away in the woods. Only her parents knew about it, and since Haru had never seen anyone else near it, they allowed her to go there for her water chores. Pointedly pulling at the neck of her dress, the feeling of being watched vanished. She smiled while pulling off her dress and replacing it with a spare tunic, just in case. She doused her clothes into the cool river of the glistening pond, fed by a river traveling from the nearby mountain that the Lord lived in. The brunette continually rubbed and scrubbed until the brown-worn dress was soaking wet, but now clean. She wrung it out well before hanging it over a tree to start drying. while she did the same with her handkerchief that she used for a hair restraint, and then washed herself. The water was always cold, but it was refreshing, and helped ease her pain as the dried earth melted off her body to become a brown cloud in the water before settling on the bottom. She repeatedly dunked herself, running her hands through her dark hair to dislodge any and all filth. The cold water was doing wonders for her sore hands. This would be the last time that she would ever use this pond. She would be leaving her home today. She wasn't safe here. Between the other surviving farms and the landlord, the Yoshiokas had always been viewed as strange, and she wouldn't be too surprised if a mob came, accusing her of being a witch that brought the sickness, disregarding the fact that her own mother had died. And the landlord? She suppressed a shudder, remembering his visit after his soldiers told him about the girl that would be burying her own mother. He had taken the cow for the death tax, although he made it clear that he didn't want the cow. It would only be a matter of time before he came back with another tax that would need to be paid, knowing full well that she didn't have the means to pay it by any method but the one he wanted. She shuddered again, remembering his toothless grin, his two bright eyes. Haru would leave him the house for the tax, knowing that her parents would understand. She wasn't the prettiest girl in the area, but she wasn't exactly a dog either. Her honor was all she had left, and she made it plain to any that tried to threaten it that she wouldn't surrender her honor without a fight. Her father's blade had proven to be very useful, although she was no match for any armed man without her special technique, although she knew that they would eventually force her to do it when the shock wore off. The cut on her neck had changed to a scab, a small reminder of what awaited her if she stayed here. Even now, she kept her father's blade tied to her waist, just in case. She wished there was a way that she could take her mother's baking stone with her, the one she and her mother had used for years to bake the family's special bread. The stone itself wasn't extraordinary. It was gray, flat, and an oval shape. But when it was carefully placed on other stones over a fire, wonderful little mounds of bread could cook on the surface. They couldn't make the treat as often as Haru would have liked, since they couldn't afford to go to the mill, which always demanded a price for its use. The grains had to be grounded by hand, a process that could take several days, if one happened to get lucky and the animals didn't get into it. The family bread was special because it never tasted the same twice. This was due to the fact that whatever herbs took her mother's fancy were pounded into the dough, along with the hand-grounded flour. Sometimes there were terrible batches that had to be eaten anyways, despite the taste. But memories of the better ones would keep them trying again. Haru grinned at herself as she sat on a flat rock next to the pond, combing out her hair with her fingers as it dried, just like she always did. Whatever spirit that kept watch over her family's shack apparently had an appetite for the special bread, since sometimes a loaf would disappear, replaced by a gold coin. Her parents were grateful for the mysterious benefactor, who made keeping their home possible more than once. But even if by some miracle she could pound enough grain to make the bread and sell it before the landlord came again, she no longer felt like this place was home without her mother or father. The brunette dressed herself and tied her handkerchief back into her hair as she waded through a few bushes trying to find some berries for breakfast, with only modest success. She had no doubt whatsoever that she could find a job elsewhere. She was a hard-working girl that was easy to get along with, as long as the idiots kept their mouths shut and hands to themselves. Then again, if they could do that, they wouldn't be called idiots. She used the bucket she had brought to get some water, to give the seeds over her mother's grave some nourishment before she left. She hoped that the fighting pair had gone somewhere else. They hadn't. As soon as she re-entered the clearing her shack was in, the feeling of being watched returned, like it had been waiting for her. The vibes rippled like the water she had just been in, but she had no clue why. The crow still had an advantage over the cat due to his wings, and appeared to be enjoying himself immensely. "You'll have to do better than that, piggy." The fat cat was still going strong, much to the girl's surprise.
He was pouncing into the air, trying to get at the infuriating bird. Haru's eyes suddenly sharpened, watching the cat do something terrible without realizing it. The brunette decided to inform him. She stormed over to the fat feline, using both arms to give appropriate power to the filled bucket in them, still filled with ice-cold water that sloshed slightly. Baron and his king watched with a horrified amusement as Haru swept the water from her bucket into a long arch, completely soaking Muta and the area around him. He howled from the cold, turning to hiss at her, but he stopped, staring at her. The feline lord could understand his servant's confusion, as well as that of the disbelieving kings. He had shown Muta and Toto what Haru looked like while she was still sleeping and dirty, so that they would know her. The brunette did quite look like a different person when she was cleaned up, making her inner and outer beauty much easier to see. Her skin wasn't the pale color so admired by the fairy court, but a medium brown from working under the sun all day and most of her life. But although she was hardly better than a serf, she stood tall as the cat stared at her, the crow nearly stopping in mid-flight before landing on the branch of a nearby tree, a light chuckle starting to issue from his throat. "Get off my mother's grave," she hissed, her eyes far angrier than Muta's had been. He looked down and shuddered in horror. He had practically been dancing over a corpse.